I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands from which I speak from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Alastair. I have the privilege of leading the Humanitech Lab, and I'll be your moderator today. Humanitech is an initiative of Australian Red Cross working at the intersection between humanity and technology. Humanitech Lab supports organisations to explore the role of emerging technologies to address communities' problems caused by disasters and emergencies, climate change and inequity and injustice. Today's roundtable discussions will shed light on a real struggle we often face when trying to develop, deploy, scale and amplify technology in community. A struggle we all realise the importance to address, the importance of breaking down silos to enable meaningful collaboration within and across sectors to create impactful and lasting change. The sheer size of the problems the world faces today, along with the interconnectedness that society thrives on, doesn't allow us to have a silo approach. As siloed approaches to problem solving will only get us so far. We must come together and work together, as it's the only way we can move forward. This session is all about hearing some practical insights, the good, the bad, and the ugly of building cross-sector partnerships for change, from technologists who are working at the intersection of technology and humanity. On the agenda this afternoon, we will have some light introductions from our incredible panel, followed by a 30-minute Q&A, then passing over to you, the audience, both in real life and then also virtually on Zoom. So the laptop here is for everyone in the virtual world to pass on questions, and I'll read them as we go. So get those notepads out of your tote bags, write down those and jot down those questions as they come fresh in the mind. I'm thrilled today to be joined by these three incredible panelists, as I've had the pleasure to get to know and work with each of these organisations over the last 12 months as they participate in Humanitech Lab's innovation program. So let's send out a huge warm welcome to our panellists today, starting off with Jo Glesta, co-founder and CEO of Climasens. Jo is helping build climate resilience in our world through technological innovation. Over the past decade, he has worked in a multitude of positions that have allowed him to work in the climate sector and technology, enabling him to understand what it takes for these two mega trends to combine and improve the planet. Emma Koster, founder of Goodhood. Goodhood is an organisation developing tech-driven projects for a fairer, safer world. With a dual disciplinary background in technology and community development, Emma's work aims to embed a culture of fairness, simplicity, and community advocacy throughout all phases of strategic and product development. Bit of a tongue twister, that one, so thanks. And then, unfortunately, Juliette Murphy, CEO of FloodMapp, has the pesky flu and won't be able to join us today. However, we do have Henry Walshaw join us, senior Python developer at FloodMapp. Henry is a skilled leader in the field with 12 years development experience in Python with a particular expertise in GIS, spatial and numeric analysis. Henry has extensive experience teaching Python for spatial analysis with Python Charmers Limited and actively contributes to open source GIS Python libraries. So a warm welcome, panelists. Thank you so much for joining. Let's kick things off and get to know each of the panel members and their incredible organisations. So I'll pass the virtual mic over to Jo to kick things off. Thanks, Jo.
Hi, gang. How are you? So what we've been doing at Climasens for the past, 4 or 5 years now has really been understanding what practitioners need in terms of the climate evidence to build resilient worlds. We started off as a business really building out real-time information through sensor technology, understanding how adaptation occurs on the ground level within urban environments. Since then, and since climate change has become a little more sexy than 4 or 5 years ago, we started to change, and we've moved now into the climate risk mapping area. So understanding exactly where the vulnerabilities and exposure are for assets, peoples, and places. Looking at the past, the current, and also the future risk to us. And what we've been doing with the Red Cross is understanding population risk in heat vulnerability. So really mapping out across Australia where these pockets of vulnerability are first, and then understanding what that heat risk is to these people so that we can better inform planning, preparedness, and response to when these events kick off. So that's my little introduction spiel. I'll pass it over to Emma.
Oh, thanks, Joe. So, hi everyone, thanks for coming today. So I'm Emma from Goodhood, and I've come to the Humanitech team, I guess, family, through a project called Solinary, which is a multilingual health platform, and it essentially works like a big old database that is designed to power a range of different health apps for multilingual community members. So by taking just kind of standard text, we work with community members from different cultural backgrounds to translate it and make sure it's safe and culturally informed. And then it's stored as like a reusable digital asset. So if there's one of the projects with Solinary, we've got health alerts in pilot at the moment with the Department of Health in Victoria. So if there's a gastro outbreak, which there hasn't been since the pilot launched, because that's how these things go, but they'll be able to use the Solinary health alert interface to send out instant translated health alerts to different medical practitioners and community organisations and childcares and things like that. With Humanitech, we're building Mama Talk, which is a consumer-facing app. So again, using our Solinary database plus some additional content. We're creating a pregnancy app for women from non-English speaking backgrounds so that we can improve attendance to antenatal sessions. We can really look at addressing some of the really shocking data around birth trauma for women from non-English speaking backgrounds in this country and try to close that gap in terms of health outcomes. So we're piloting in Arabic. It's in full, oh my God, it's a nightmare at the moment, but that's good because we're about to really get going in the next 2 weeks with that. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Emma. And Henry.
Beautiful. Thanks, Al. Thanks, Em. Hi, I'm from FloodMapp. FloodMapp specializes in real-time flood intelligence for emergency managers before, during, and after major flood events, or really any flood events. So our goal is to provide and improve safety, prevent damage, and provide highly accurate, real-time, property-level, dynamic flood, inundation, and depth insights for communities. What we do is we have a model called DASH, which is a world-first flood modeling tool built from scratch to provide real-time flood analytics in a postcast for the last 30 days, a nowcast for the current extent of flood waters, and a forecast for the next 24 hours where we expect the flood waters to get to. Combine big data analytics, automation, and machine learning techniques with novel hydrology and hydraulic modeling, and the subject matter expertise of our hydrological engineers at FloodMapp to give that data to our clients. With Humanitech, we are starting a project to try and break down the silos between different organisations at the state and at the local level to provide better outcomes for communities and agencies within our pilot region. So what we're doing is we are providing this data across all agencies, a common operating picture to our participants, so that they receive fast, effective disaster relief, ideally immediately after the flood, to reduce the vulnerabilities that communities will have in these regions and provide for a strong recovery.
Cool.
Thanks, Henry. What unfortunate, timely use cases in this modern world that we live in. As this week we've seen in Europe, extreme weather conditions, heat. Funnily enough, we do have one of our project managers in Greece at the moment presenting the work that Climasens has been doing within Humanitech, and so yeah, it's timely and it's
More
great.
relevant there than it is here right now during the La Nina year, that's for sure.
Indeed, and then floods last week in the Hunter Valley. So, yeah, very, very fortunate to have such incredible panelists today and incredible organisations to share some really sort of some amazing use cases. Now let's get under the hood and kick off this discussion. First question. You all also don't have to answer each question, so don't feel like you're inclined, not to worry. What does it take to break down silos through building meaningful partnerships and collaborations? What has worked well, and also what hasn't? Who would like to take it first?
All right, fine.
You got
So I guess in our work, it's, and immediately I'm going to change the scope of the question. Sorry, Albert, you should have known better. So it's less about silos for us and more about barriers. And it's really, maybe it could be the same thing if we just follow the metaphor through. But in terms of, the challenges that we have, it's oftentimes decisions are made before a community is involved. We were just talking about this earlier. So one of the barriers we have is that the need isn't quite getting through to the policymakers or the decision makers or the funders in a timely way, and then the process starts of co-design or consultation, and we don't have that room we need to kind of make those changes, and we don't have the right people in the room to kind of create a really meaningful design. And I think also in the communities that we work with, like power is such a big problem, the patriarchy is such a big problem, you know, the legacy of colonialism is such a big problem, like a really Western framed context is challenging when we work in the Pacific and we kind of, or we're working with First Nations communities, because there are all of these incredibly indentured structures and barriers that are in situ that, you know, one small project struggles to shift. So I think, sorry, that's probably huge. Can I hand the mic over somewhere?
Yeah, sure.
I'm happy to take this. I think I probably speak a little bit to both Henry and I's side of the world with climate change and natural hazards. Oftentimes within government, you have these agencies that have been built specifically for this. And, you know, you rely upon this to actually work. And then, okay.
Hello.
Hey,
That's
mate.
fine.
Sorry, squeaky. And so you have these agencies who have been set up, have people who have been in there for decades, building out strategies and ways of, I guess, explaining our climate and or natural hazards and or flooding or yada, yada, yada. There's a set way and there's often underfunding. And so oftentimes a startup trying to come in and play ball in these hugely institutionalized agencies has just no space and no room to play. So luckily, academia has an entry point, trust in academics. And so as a startup, we really focused on building our rapport through academia and industry buy-in through knowing people who worked with academics. So actually the way in which we kind of navigated the partnerships and the way in which we kind of busted down silos was going through academics who had rapport with these agencies in order for us to get an in and start discussing some of the work that the academics were doing in this area and then translating that into products. So a bit of a Trojan horse approach for startups, especially in climate change, but I think it's been successful thus far because, you know, the holy trinity is industry, academia, and a startup working together and working together effectively. And so as long as you ensure that everyone's kind of on equal ground and everyone's getting a benefit out of it, then you're able to kind of succeed in navigating that. It's not to say I've cracked it at all, but it seems to be a better way in which we approach these partnerships. It's never coming in with force, it's always coming in with something to offer and something grounded in intelligence, right? Trust in academia. We do know our shit. We just have to put it in a product is all.
You've really read the room
Thanks.
well, haven't you,
Yeah,
Joe?
well, hey,
I mean, I meant to say that as well. Evidence-based.
That's it.
appreciate your work.
Thanks, Joe. So yeah, we at FloodMapp, we have a similar idea in the sense that we know that within any emergency context, there's a huge number of stakeholders. Just within Australia, we have fire and emergency service response agencies on a state-by-state basis. We have, again, police and ambulance agencies, again, on a state-by-state basis. And we have departments for federal government, local government, and everywhere in between. But not only them, we also have large private industries managing that critical infrastructure. So from our perspective, to make sure that that information, to break down those silos and walls, to encourage collaboration, and to make sure that people are on the same page as fast as possible, which we know reduces the likelihood of damage and reduces the likelihood of injury and loss of lives. We have taken a slightly different approach. We take the attitude that the emergency managers who are using this information have platforms already. So rather than providing our own unique platform that they then have to somehow integrate into their own tools or to try and migrate existing tools to our platform, what FloodMapp have chosen to do is to provide data streams instead. So we use open standards of data streams, and we use some closed standards of data streams as well for those clients that request it. But rather than providing a specific platform, our current goal is to make sure that everyone's on the same page as fast as possible by just providing the data, and then leaving it up to the emergency managers, the experts in the field, the people on the ground to interpret that data in the tools they already have, in the tools that they're familiar with, so they can be on board as fast as possible.
I'm going to ask a question to that model. Was
Sure.
that the first model that FloodMapp came up with when, or was it
Well-
trial and error of actually trying to break down those barriers and silos?
Well, I can't speak specifically to this. I've been with FloodMapp personally for about 14 months, but the original model for FloodMapp was as a specific app, at least so that we could get it in front of people and show people what our modeling could do. But pretty quickly we realized that that just wasn't going to cut it if we wanted it to bring it into those management organizations, because they aren't going to want to have 7 different apps up on a screen and hope that someone's got the right app installed on their computer or their iPad or their tablet when they're out in the field. So pretty quickly it became apparent to their founders, Jules and Ryan, that rather than simply providing an app, we're better off to focus on the things that we do well, which is the modeling and the QA on those models, and then provide that information once we've built those models, built those outputs to the people on the ground.
Lovely. I feel like it's a common phrase is, oh, not another app or another dashboard or a platform. So that's good to hear. And
Well, shit.
second question. Technology and societal challenges are ever evolving and growing. How are you matching community needs with the changing pace of technology?
Oh, I'll start and then someone jump in.
The line here.
Okay, I guess again, so what we do at Good Hood is we try to take as simple as possible technology approach, because oftentimes I feel like, having worked in the tech industry for 17 or 18 years, tech's really good at making something really complicated that doesn't need to be that complicated. I think the cynic in me, which is probably 80% of me, says that that's because then they can charge more money, and if you can kind of completely obfuscate what it is that's actually happening, hide it in a black box, then you can send those invoices. So what we do with Good Hood is try to make our technology as accessible as possible. So the technology, we don't use any kind of sophisticated algorithmic processes in our work, because often for Solinary, English is not the language that we're using, and we're working in languages that even Google Translate won't deal with, because there isn't enough consumer power or enough population for them to care about. So our tech has to be accessible to people who are often forgotten in terms of the digital context. And so that could be, across the Pacific, we look at First Nations languages. We're building software that will be scalable to be able to accommodate First Nations languages and accommodate informal languages, which means that there's this trade-off in terms of the sophistication of the actual product. So, you know, that's something that I think it doesn't sound as maybe as exciting, you know, in a kind of startup context, and that's a struggle that we really have, is getting people to believe that, you know, having a chatbot that's built on simple kind of keyword navigation is just as good as something that has this kind of NLP feature, because it means that we're able to communicate with people via SMS in a far-flung province of the Solomon Islands who previously haven't been able to get that access to information. But not everyone loves that pitch. Maybe I'm just not that very good at kind of pitching it. I don't know. But like, I think, you know, that's one of the challenges. So it's really about not so much us keeping up with the pace of technology, but trying to make sure funders and partners are really interested in making sure we don't leave people behind as the pace of technology increases.
And is there a balance between that practicality and sophistication? Or do you think practicality outweighs that sophistication?
It's tricky. And I think it's like there's no rule. And I think, you know, some of the challenges that we have is technical literacy as well. So, you know, something that I think about, you know, usually at 3 a.m. Is like, you know, how do we develop something for a community member who has no idea what a chatbot is, or has no idea what this concept is? How do we deliver that in an ethical way that isn't tricking them into thinking or misleading them, or not doing a very good job of explaining what's happening? I think because in our work, consent and ethics, like, you know, is just so central to having a human rights-based approach. So how do we make sure that we're able to articulate or kind of do some capacity building in the sense of the community and their tech literacy, but also capacity building from funders and partners in our decision making and what's kind of a good program design? That didn't answer your question, but that's okay. I think the 2 points I wanted to make.
I just don't think we'll ever catch up. I think there'll always be an imbalance between technology and community need until that technological readiness and willingness and understanding is more ubiquitous. I think we're still at the age where analog and digital there's a gap, right? So it'll be decades before that really does come into play, that everyone is digitally literate.
And then I'm going to put a lens from your perspective. Community need, changing pace of technology, and government response.
Yeah.
Do you think government responds as the community's needs are required, or do you think?
I think government employees are responsive.
Okay.
And there's incredible people working in organizations doing incredible things. Whether or not the bureaucracy allows that and the red tape is cut enough for that progress to be made is actually the question. Having worked in government for many years, there's a lot of people doing a lot of good things, but it's just the red tape gets in the way, because oftentimes we're just trying to cover our tracks, making sure that nothing bad is happening instead of everything good, right? That makes sense. We're just trying to make sure that we don't do something wrong instead of keep pushing the right. And I think that's, well, let's hope that changes.
Indeed.
I think, sorry, Henry. Just on that, I think technology and government are strange bedfellows as well, because government is responsible for the public funds. So they, you know, what we come up against all the time is they need the evidence, they need the proof, they need to kind of see how this is absolutely going to deliver value. But when you're working in innovation and when you're working in kind of this space, we're building that evidence as we go. So it's really hard to get that kind of investment and to get the government to come on board with a new technology as, you know, in a new kind of context. I think that's a big challenge.
Is that when we fall on academia to support us with that evidence?
Yes, and that's like, you'd be pleased to know that a large portion of our budgets all go to La Trobe. But anyway, I hope there's someone here from La Trobe who help us build our evidence of what works, what doesn't work, and to try and really drive our research uptake, because that's a way that we can feel confident that we're not causing harm and that we're iterating. And that is the thing, is like, technology likes to be fast. Building this kind of tech with a government as a key stakeholder is slower. And then just to the elephant in the room too, in terms of industry, one of the things that just annoys me so much is, we're not hearing about it so much at the moment, but the space race, when we talk about the space race, and I just think it's such a bullshit thing to be worried about, because we have, on the one hand, we can send tourists to space. That's where we're at in terms of technology and innovation. But on the other hand, we can't get the SMS signals to communities within Australia because there isn't the will. And I think that's kind of one of the things that is, a key barrier or silo, is around that kind of, who has the will to kind of push the agenda for people who are largely isolated or discriminated against.
Yeah, and look, I agree. I think it's an interesting problem. Personally, I find that, particularly in the emergency management space, governments tend to be very reactive. You'll notice, or for those of you that have been around as long as I have, you might remember the response for the Asian tsunami in 2005. There was a huge influx of cash, and it was much needed in the emergency management community for this. But and likewise again, after the 2003 bushfires in Canberra, the 2009 bushfires down here in Victoria, and again we're starting to get an influx of funding for flood response activities after the flooding this year, and fire influx funding after the 2020 bushfires. But it's not, as much as I would like it to be, we don't seem to do things in a preventative way. We seem to do things in a very reactive way. One of the things that we find in our space is that flood studies exist. So there are traditional flood studies which are static, and they're done by very, very skillful consultants, people that spend a lot of time and a lot of effort doing very accurate mapping and very accurate understanding for a set of pre-known conditions. So we will say that given this particular scenario, this is the expected flood extent. So this makes them extremely valuable tools for planning, and honestly that's one of the real positives of those things. Unfortunately, they also are very costly, so they tend to be only done in the more well-off communities. And again, in Australia, the less well-off communities also have less long-term flood studies done. But it also makes those tools less useful for an immediate event. So if we have a large flood in, say, the centre of Melbourne for whatever reason, yes, we can have all the flood studies in the world, but handing those flood studies across to the general public, or even people who are in a hurry in an emergency management context, they're hard to interpret. They are designed for expert users. So we see the advance of technology and be able to give information in a shorter response in real time as a net win. And the key is for us is to make that as broadly available as possible, kind of crossing those boundaries and not being sort of restricted to just the areas that can afford it.
Very interesting. And even to that point that you raised, government federal budget, 97% is spent on for disasters and emergencies on responding, and 3% on preparedness. Jumping now to a bit more around automated decision-making questions. Automated decision-making now plays a major role in profiling. With overwhelming amounts of data, personal information, organisations can collect on an individual, such as internet searches, buying habits, lifestyle, behaviour data gathered from mobile phones, social networks, video surveillance, even your MyKey, your IoT. Information is then analysed to classify people into different groups or sectors using algorithms and machine learning. Organisations use this profiling to find something about individual preferences, predict their behaviour, and or make decisions about them. This can be very useful for organisations and individuals in sectors, but then also, if used irresponsibly, can play and have significant risks for those individuals, and most importantly, as we've just raised, vulnerable communities and those that are unheard. all your three organizations work in and around automated decisions in various forms. When it comes to applying automated decision making in your work, what are some of your learnings and experiences, both good and the bad? I might flip it over this side.
Sure.
To start.
Yeah, just for brevity, yep.
Perfect. Thanks, Al. So yeah, as Alastair suggested, at FloodMapp, our Dash model is primarily an automated system. So this means that we can very, very quickly get a good response back, provided that we have models trained for a particular region and provided that we have good input data. The risk for this, like in any modeling, is to say that that is the be-all and end-all. So for us, while we don't sort of gather personal identifying information, we realize that when we're producing information at a granularity that is, realistically, we can get down to meter scale or better, which means that we can say, your house is flooded, yours is not. Okay? But this is done on an automated basis. So as our check, we spend and we invest heavily in a QA process. And that QA process involves quite a lot of manual work from experts in the field who will look at the models that are produced on an hourly basis. They'll compare that to incoming real-time data feeds. We'll sit there, for example, in the New South Wales floods up in, I can't remember, it starts with W, out northwest of Sydney. There's a lovely traffic camera that looks across a bridge. Can't remember, I'm sorry, Whitehall or something. But likewise in Brisbane, during the Brisbane floods earlier this year, we have automated traffic cameras. We have incoming data from social media. We have data coming from government sources about where the flood extent is on the ground, even things from news reports. Our QA officers will sit there and manually compare those results to our models with the idea that we want to make these as accurate as possible. And we still provide these with the assurance that, yes, we have QA'd these as much as possible, but they may not always be 100% correct. And I think the reason we do that is because it's a mistake to assume that because it's on a map, it's true. It's a model. For those that kind of work in the mapping space, all maps lie to you, more or less.
Google Maps or...
Exactly. I mean, not to say that they're deliberately being malicious or anything like that, but it's an abstraction at best. It's a model. It's not necessarily what's on the ground. So a big challenge for us is then communicating that to our clients. And I think we're quite lucky in that space as well, because our clients are in that emergency management community, in the sense that we can explain that they are at least not necessarily expert hydrologists, but experts in the emergency management space. So we can kind of communicate the idea that these are models, we will QA these models. And then the other thing that we can do is we can take feedback. It's one of the big things that I think that many times that I've worked in these kind of projects before, the missing piece is after the event, how well did we do? So we get a lot of information back from our clients when they're willing to supply it. And of course, we don't pass that on, but we do use that to improve our modeling and to essentially run scenarios against the information that we've got to say, how well did we do? I think that's kind of another big, important step.
Definitely.
Cool. We'll reverse that order. I guess with great power comes great responsibility. It's so cliche, but what we do in terms of mapping out the future is really fantastic to understand exactly where things are going to go wrong. And on the flip side of that, if you know where things are going wrong, you also know where not to be, where not to invest, right? And so that's the danger in what we do is, providing this information to understand exactly where these vulnerable populations will be and where this harm is going to come. On the flip side, if someone wanted to use that and say where not to be, when those events are going to happen, where should I go? Should I maybe just book it down to Tassie and get out of Dodge? That might be the better option. These things are not in our control. I mean, we can control who we give this information to, but ultimately what we're trying to do is create a service that provides this information so that intelligence is there, and what you do with that is your decision. We choose to use it for good. So we choose the organizations that we work for as a way of extending our brand, but also ensuring that what we're doing is for a good reason. I think ultimately it comes down to us when we have this choice. We're not TikTok. We don't have to take everyone's information and use it to create profiles. but we do want to make sure that this information is being used for good. I'll leave it there. I think it's up to us to kind of make that decision.
And I guess in the context of our work, automated decision making, like always the first question to me is probably why? Like, why is this being made? Because again, another kind of trait of technology is that, you know, it's just good for everything. We'll just put it everywhere, and it's so often not the case, and often is a bit of a disaster when it comes to human-based issues and community-based issues. So I would really challenge the helpfulness of automated decision-making in the context. Not to say that it would never work, and I have actually listened to the podcast that came from here a few weeks ago around automated decision-making in child and family services. So if I was to kind of put the Solinary project aside for a moment and focus on our work in gender-based violence, I know in Victoria at least we have the MARAM, which is a tool for assessing kind of risk levels in a family violence context. So I guess that is an, albeit fairly analogue, but an instrument of automated decision-making in terms of classifications. I believe it's still called the MARAM, or it's called the CRAMP. Sorry, terrible acronyms. But you know, something, so I can see the helpfulness in guiding an approach that is clear. There's a clear kind of line of governance in that the agency that is responsible for triaging a particular individual, that is responsible for, you know, assessing a situation, there is this kind of evidence-based process and a clear line of governance. And I think that governance part is where ADM, automated decision-making, comes a bit unstuck in, like, when we just kind of throw it into a tech solution. And then the other thing I wanted to say about that is when we're thinking about working with communities who experience vulnerabilities, labels and classifications are so sticky. You know, we're often working with people who are experiencing various intersecting forms of discrimination, who have been forgotten or ignored, and then to go and kind of label or classify is a further, I would argue, has the potential to be a further dehumanizing experience. So in terms of our work and automated decision making, yeah, I think I'm not saying never, but I think it really is something that requires incredibly close scrutiny in terms of, you know, making the decision to do it, how it's governed, and what that process is to ensure its efficacy and it doesn't, and the do no harm approach.
I feel like in some ways I should also at least defend automated decision making as well. There are, it's a bit strange, but there are times when having an automated solution is a preference. So there was a great example of this last year, 2021, in Sapphire in Queensland. Mm-hmm. They had a flood, and again, we're from FloodMapp, so that's what we care about. And they had a $300 million alarm system, which didn't go off. And the reason it didn't go off was because it required a person in the office at 1 in the morning, on the morning that it flooded, to press the button to actually sound the alarm in town.
I really feel for that person.
Yeah. It's tough. And that person, unfortunately, was trapped by the flood. So they couldn't actually make it in, set off the alarm. So, of course, the residents of the town woke up to massive inundation. Huge, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of damage to properties. Hopefully, I'm not sure of the exact statistics, but I don't believe any loss of life at least. But it does kind of point out the idea that there is a good place for automation. It's just that we kind of, again, shouldn't blindly trust it.
And in the right use case.
Yeah, exactly. And sorry.
I'm going to be just being mindful a bit about time because I would
shush.
love to pass it over to the audience for some questions. So I'm going to ring the bell and say this is the final question to the panelists. How can we all, and I'm only going to let one of you respond, so I'm mindful of time. How can we all work together to ensure that the right stakeholders are consulted to increase equity, sorry?
I'm going to talk because I'm the woman on the panel. So thank you. You know, I think this is something that requires a level of humility as well. And I think that's definitely a lesson that I learn on almost every single project, about who didn't get invited, who should have been invited, who didn't get enough time to speak. You know, we talked about this just offline before about how long to have these community consultations for. And I'm basically like, from 1 o'clock until the day is over, that's my, we just don't have really an end time, because it's really essential from a community perspective that we do get those voices heard. And in terms of, to me, the community is the most important stakeholder, and because that's what we're doing it for. And even though we've got, also very important are other kind of sector players and people also operating in this space, because why compete when you can collaborate? And I think that's also really essential when we're looking at developing work for like social impact, essentially. And then in terms of getting, policymakers and kind of the moneyed stakeholders, I think this is really about capacity building for them as well. So often I think there's this approach that we need to go in and help these people who need to upskill or build their capacity in a particular way. But actually, from a monitoring and evaluation perspective, from a program design perspective, there's so much that I can see in terms of knowledge and capacity that gets transferred from community to funder to policymaker, that I think really trying to level that playing field and really bring people around a table, even if it's a tiny little round table like this one, which is really funny for a round table talk. They weren't joking. But yeah, I think that's essential.
Definitely. And thank you to our lovely 3 panelists for lifting up the hood, diving deep. I feel like a lot of these topics and even questions are often systemic problems and bigger than just to be addressing in a panel discussion. So thank you all. I feel like now let's pass over the mic virtually. This is why I got this laptop here, to see what the virtual people in the virtual world will pose if they are willing to post any virtual questions. And then I'm going to pass it over to the audience. We roughly have around 10 minutes for questions, so don't feel like you all need to jump to asking the first question. I'll open it up. Who would like to ask the first question? Yep, we've got a mic. Great.
Thank you so much. Dan Angus from QUT. So my question is around, you exist in a interesting space as a not-for-profit kind of somewhere between government, society and such. And it's about your duty to those organisations that have kind of been there for a long time, right? So community orgs that have been practising, say, for 40, 50 years or something, build up significant knowledge bases, and you're kind of there, the Johnny-come-latelys in a way. And I don't mean this in an kind of favourable way or an uncharitable way towards you. It's amazing work you're doing. But that kind of duty of care, when you're going to, say, build a knowledge bank or a chat bot or something, and you go online and you start to draw on resources that have been resourced and essentially paid for, or the labour that's gone into that has been on behalf of a community organisation. What's your duty to those organisations where their continued survival is often on part of their continuing member base and continuing to develop those resources, and now you're there kind of as another player in that space, but you're kind of drawing on that labour and not necessarily directly giving back into the ongoing development of that kind of core knowledge base. Is that something that you want to maybe just ruminate on a bit? Yeah.
That literally happened to us the other day. We were having a discussion with an NGO. He said, look, I love what you do, and I think it's really important what you're doing, but if there was funding on the table, I wouldn't put my hand up, because we're so stretched, and this really could be going to other things. And I think you have to know when that line is there and when not to cross it, and when to actually walk away and say, you're right. Like, maybe this isn't something worth pursuing, because you are an organization that does rely on public funding or philanthropic funding. And, here we are, a startup, building a platform, building a dashboard that's going to help people, but who gives a shit, right? If they've got real work to be done and they've got things that need to happen, and that funding could be allocated to them, then you do need to take that back. So you need to make sure that what you're doing really is the right thing. right? And so it's going back to your choice as that person who has that power, right?
And it's
Oh, sorry.
coming from I guess like a funder perspective, it's really interesting, and something that really resonated with me a couple of years back is talking about that sort of lasting impactful impact that you can create, especially within communities. Is we often have this privilege where we have some funds where we can support really innovative organizations that hopefully will scale and amplify 10x, 100x impact. But we also have to relate to the fact that we could also give those funds to a community directly, and they could scale and use that. And so for me and for Humanitech, we always look at the fact that we do have this sense of, I guess, overwhelming opportunity, and we need to really cement that we can provide that amplification through technology and innovation that is beyond what the community can do for themselves.
And just like on that, so real world case study. So Hello Cass is a chatbot for family and sexual violence that we developed 4 or 5 to 100 years ago. It's been a big kind of labour of love and despair. So basically that was like just a Goodhood brainchild, and it was about kind of, I guess what we thought we were doing was helping to provide accessible and helping people to overcome barriers to disclosure, and helping people to augment help seeking around family and sexual violence. And this is pre-Me Too. So it was, if you can cast your minds back to like 2016 when we kicked this off, it was a very different conversation. So we started kind of completely bootstrapped, and then I got a fellowship from the Kenneth Meyer Foundation, thank you very much, to help build it. And what it turns out I was doing was in fact disrupting the family and sexual violence sector, which, as you say, has been running off the smell of an oily rag for 30 or 40 years. And as much as I engage them as stakeholders, I learned a really valuable lesson of engaging as stakeholders means having funding on the table, Emma. And like my fellowship grant wasn't going to be enough to kind of engage. Hello Cass became a not-for-profit because I couldn't feel like I could resolve it being a social enterprise, but I couldn't make money off it. It didn't feel like the right thing to do. And the revenue stream, or the revenue model, was about essentially aggregating data and providing that data to various agencies, for which there was just no real appetite to buy that data from, So I made the decision earlier this year to wrapping Hello Cass Australia, because first of all, I should never have been allowed to run a not-for-profit, because holy shit, I can't get a board together. It's really it's very difficult, the things that kind of just break you in the end. But also the problem shifted, and what is a better use of this kind of project is that we now have moved it to be a blueprint and like open source for low to middle income countries, and that's what we're doing in Solomon Islands. And so making it, I guess, available for people as a starting point to kind of have their own chatbot service. And then the knowledge that we've kind of learned, I consult back to Our Watch, so we're all friends in the end. But I guess it was a bit of a rocky road in terms of not that we received any government funding, but I think just the appearance of a new player in a space that has been wrought by the blood, sweat and tears of serious grassroots community activists who have kind of fought for us to get to a place where there is finally some significant funding in the sector is like, great question. Thank you for asking, because it's definitely something that we think about all the time.
Anyone else in the audience? Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your excellent expertise and experience. I think you emphasized that to better deal with the disaster or respond to disasters or emergency situations, so you emphasized that recognizing pre-existing information or prior known information is extremely important. So within the context of like bushfire or flooding, then what kinds of information should we consider to be valuable prior known information? That's first question. And second question is, what are the current primary practices of collecting such information?
Sure. Look, I'm happy to speak to at least some of that. So in terms of what's the most useful pre-existing information, it's a bit of a tough one to answer because it always depends on the scale of the area that you're looking at. So if I'm doing a study or if we're working with a particular local council, they are absolutely going to be, or hopefully should be, the custodians of the kind of the highest quality primary source information. So that will include things like pre-existing flood studies that the council have done, as well as records of historic events in those regions. So typically if a council is doing flood studies, it might have flooded there once or twice before, so hopefully they'll have some information available. But if we're looking at a state or a national scale, then we need to look towards those larger organisations. We're very fortunate in Australia that we have initiatives like the Open Data Initiative. So we can access data from state and federal government agencies basically free of charge or at a minimal cost, and more importantly, that information is searchable. So the Bureau of Meteorology, for example, has a vast wealth of information. They are truly the custodians of Australia's climate record. We're never going to try and supplant them. We want to be their friends, basically. So if they've got that information, we will happily use it. In terms of gathering that data, a lot of that is in consultation with our clients. So we'll talk to our clients about the primary sources of data that they have access to, as well as the study region that they're looking at. We will attempt to do some open source data gathering ourselves, and of course we will refer back to historic records in the area and that data that's available on the open government portals. And that's the same for Australia, the US, or anywhere else we might be working. So yeah, it's a tough one. It really depends on the scale.
Good to know.
Hey, I'm Amelia Radke from the University of Queensland. My question is in relation to the long-term effects of your tech. So for example, flood maps, we find that a lot of low SES communities live in flood-prone areas, and therefore it causes further issues for them getting insurance, which we recently saw with the floods. So I guess my question is around, how do you navigate questions around responsibility when your tech and your apps or your platforms could, in the long term, actually recreate an inequality?
Yeah, that's tough. So it's a fantastic question, so thank you for that. Within FloodMapp, we, in a sense, take the goal that we're not trying to provide long-term planning information. Yes, we will see that there are communities that are more or less prone to flooding. But the idea for us is to provide assistance and emergency response to kind of close to real time. So we take the view that what we're trying to do, particularly for those low SES communities, is to provide information to help prevent property damage, existing injury, loss of life, that they just wouldn't have had access to before. So if we can do that by providing the models, providing the tools, we see that as a net benefit. I completely understand where you're coming from in terms of things like long-term insurance. Unfortunately, that's kind of, without trying to disclaim responsibility, that comes from sort of planning policy from successive generations of local, state, and federal governments, as much as it does from companies like FloodMapp. I think all we do is highlight the risks as opposed to, I guess, creating the problems. Well, that's the way I like to think of it anyway.
Yeah, you're totally right. Like Hunter Valley, that over 12 to 18 months, some areas were flooded 4 to 5 times, and yet there's property development occurring and planning still being allowed to occur in these places, which is not a flood maps problem. That's a community, a municipality, or a state government problem to deal with.
And I think this redlining is happening anyway. You know, this is the thing, is that this is absolutely happening around us. But tools like FloodMapp, can actually provide innovative solutions, right? So what we're seeing in the climate change space specifically is new types of insurance being used and applied so that they're actually more accessible. A flood premium now for someone living in a flood-prone area could be arbitrarily $15,000 a year, right? Whereas now with the use of technology, you could use parametric insurance and you could create policies that are much more affordable, but they're set based on thresholds that only technology could provide that information for, right? So as much as there are, you know, that information could be used for bad, it could also be used for good. It really comes down to how it's being used and how it's being thought through. Can we use FloodMapp as a way to kind of improve the way in which people can be, I guess, access insurance? We're seeing that model now come about quite fast in the agricultural sector, where no one wants to have a farm now, right? It's just not cost effective, but now these insurance premiums are coming out because the technology exists that can help farmers understand exactly what those thresholds should be when they should say, nope, not gonna take out a premium this year, or if I take out a premium, it'll be this small little bundle because I know exactly what that risk is. So I think it's dual-sided.
And it's actually come out of bushfires too. There's now like a co-op approach, because like these premiums, especially like say in the Alps and the up in Bulla or Falls Creek, they're just exponential, and the business owners can't afford it, so they come as a co-op and they get a collective insurance for the area.
The future of insurance is fascinating in these absolutely ridiculous times. We'll see changing of policies and the ways in which we've inherently thought insurance should be to what it could be in the future. It's a lot of uncertainty.
Okay, I'm gonna, one more question, if there is another question about. Or to the virtual world, if you can see me or hear me.
Are they there?
Hello? I did put in the chat thread, but no response. Maybe there's no one there.
Hopefully not.
If we don't have any more questions, going once, twice, always wanted
There's
to
morning
ask them.
tea. Like, no more questions.
People
it's
are
morning
starving.
tea.
Thank you all for coming this afternoon to this roundtable event on breaking silos to accelerate systems change, hosted by Humanitech. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. We'll be sticking around for a couple of minutes if you guys want to chat to any of the panelists, learn a bit more, network, swap cards, LinkedIn's, all the rest. But thank you so much for your time.